Hi there. I'm very pleased to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person for this international conference, but instead I will present in this way. And as you can see, my topic is the outcome of COP26 and the path ahead. So I'm going to look, first of all, at the major issues and the outcomes of COP26. The first thing we have to recognize is that most of the delegations are from developing countries. And for developing countries, what are important and what was important in Glasgow were two principal issues. One is finance, achieving the $100 billion per year commitment or even more, principally for adaptation, and then making up for the shortfall. After all, that was supposed to be for the year 2020. And so for the years since 2020, making up from the shortfall because it's not there. The outcome, ironically, is that the Glasgow Climate Pact urges countries to double their commitments, although even the first commitments have not yet been achieved. So this brings up the topic of loss and damage, which the notion is that here the countries most responsible for climate change, those who have contributed most to the existing stock of anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which would be the United States, China, and the European Union, would actually fund somehow the countries that are most impacted by damages that cannot be adapted for. Now, this was finessed in the Paris Agreement because the Paris Agreement says that loss and damage is a very important issue. In Glasgow, where there was again a lot of interest in this, on the last day of the talks, the European Union and the United States blocked a proposal for a new fund for loss and damage payments, and instead they set up a dialogue for research and discussion at future COPs. This was the one moment at which I was sympathetic to Greta Thunberg's characterization of the annual climate talks as blah, 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 because indeed they did call for more discussion at future COPs rather than action. Turning then to the big issues for some policy wonks, the principal one was, can China and the United States return to global co-leadership on climate policy by returning to the spirit and reality of remarkable cooperation that existed during the Obama years versus the spirit and reality of confrontation that came about during the Trump years and unfortunately has been continued during the Biden year in office. The outcome was a surprise joint announcement by the U.S. and China on Wednesday in the second week of the COP, but those joint announcements did not advance ambition and they didn't influence other countries. And then finally, outside of the UNFCCC, there were all sorts of agreements and announcements. One of the most important one is that 103 countries signed the Global Methane Pledge to cut emissions of methane 30% below the 2020 level by 2030. But China is not included, and China is the largest methane emitter, and the measurement remains highly uncertain. We're now engaged at Harvard in some research using satellite data of concentrations in order to statistically estimate country and even sectoral emissions. And then finally, I thought that the issue for everyone, the elephant in the room, would be whether or not the new U.S. nationally determined contribution, which is very ambitious, 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 by 2030 in emissions, is actually achievable with reasonably anticipated policies. And the answer is probably not, as I will explain. And I thought, therefore, that every time I met with a delegation, that this is what they would want to press me on. But no one brought it up. And I think the reason is that all three groups, delegates, civil society, and the press, are so happy to have the Biden administration instead of the Trump administration because at least they can talk with them. And of course, the Biden administration has rejoined the Paris Agreement, that there was what I'll call a willing suspension of disbelief. And so this issue was hardly discussed in polite conversation. Now, why did I say that the U.S. NDC is probably not achievable? So, is it achievable with reasonably anticipated policy action? This is, in the United States, after all, a representative democracy, and so there are established political procedures. And the only way this could happen, this could be achieved, would be with aggressive new legislation from the U.S. Congress. And even though Democrats have a total of 51 votes, the Democrats still couldn't put together 51 votes on this because at least one Democrat from the Senate was opposed. So the prospects for major comprehensive climate legislation are not good. But there is non-climate legislation that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The infrastructure legislation, although it's not explicitly climate legislation, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in the case of facilitating improvements in electricity transmission, which is very important for greater reliance on renewable sources and for greater penetration of electric vehicles, for energy efficiency, for extending the life of existing nuclear power plants. And then there's other truly bipartisan climate legislation that can be politically feasible, in particular subsidies or tax incentives. And here's subsidies for wind and solar, for carbon capture and storage, for technology initiatives, for electric vehicle rebates. Some of these included in the infrastructure legislation are all quite promising. But the sum of all of these, if you add up all of what can reasonably anticipate it, it's very unlikely to satisfy the demands of domestic green advocates in the U.S., international calls for action, or more importantly, the explicit numerical targets in the Biden administration's NDC. And so the Biden administration will have to do what the Obama administration did, and that's opt for regulatory approaches. Now, a regulatory approach is one that doesn't involve the legislature, it doesn't involve the U.S. Congress, it's purely and simply the executive branch, with an important caveat that I will mention. So there are executive orders that have been in place or will be forthcoming to reinstate and surpass the Obama administration's motor vehicle fuel efficiency standards, called CAFE standards, to reinstate the very important rule for methane leaking from wells and pipelines, a new rule under the December 2020 legislation to implement in the U.S. the important Kigali amendments for CFCs to the Montreal Protocol, and then to recalculate the social cost of carbon, which was $50 a ton in the Obama administration, taken down to $1 per ton estimate in the Trump administration, now back up to $51, and with re-estimates now being done, maybe up to $100 per ton. But the caveat I mentioned has to do with the third branch of government, the judiciary in the United States. And new regulations are more likely to be challenged successfully than during the Obama years today. And the reason for that is that there are 245 Trump-appointed federal judges. That's more than 25% of the total federal judiciary. And indeed, that social cost of carbon that I just mentioned is being challenged in the courts. More importantly, the Supreme Court now has a 6-3 conservative majority, with Trump having appointed 3 new justices. Now, I want to finish, because that may have sounded somewhat pessimistic, with 2 sources of optimism for U.S. policy action. One is that this is the United States of America, and state-level policies and actions can be important and highly effective. We have subnational policies on the West Coast and in the Northeast that are becoming increasingly important. And it's possible that bottom-up national policy or de facto national policy may evolve from these state-level and regional initiatives from essentially the Democratic-leaning states, which represent more than half of the U.S. population and an even greater share of economic activity and therefore of greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, a source of optimism is that the Biden administration seems to embrace first-rate scientific and other expertise. And some of the best scientists, lawyers, and even economists may be able to design sound climate policies that can perhaps also be politically feasible. And with that, I really do thank you very much for your attention. I enjoyed being with you, and I hope in future years I'll be able to be with you in person. Thank you.